Hello and welcome to the presentation of our survey paper recently published in Computer Graphics Forum titled, Visual Parameter Space Exploration in Time and Space. I am Nikolaus Piccolotto and this research was conducted together with my co-authors Markus Bögl and Silvia Miksch. In this presentation I will first motivate the problem and introduce some terminology, then talk about related work, and the method we used. After that I'll go through identified themes and close with open challenges. A link to our open access paper can be found by scanning the QR code. Many algorithms and simulations we use in science and industry basically look like this, with a few concrete examples in a minute. They are a complicated function mapping some parameters, dynamic inputs, and optionally input data, static inputs, onto some output. If the model is computationally expensive, a faster but less accurate surrogate model can be used alongside. Why do we care about parameters? Silvia et al. Suggested 6-parameter space analysis tasks. For instance, we might want to identify the parameter settings of a best output, or whether some parameters are even relevant. In this talk I'll mention abstract, temporal and spatial data, by which I mean that temporal data reference time, in other words, it's about instants, intervals, durations. Spatial data reference physical space, i.e., it describes points, areas, lines, volumes. Abstract data have no temporal or spatial reference, they are just numbers or graph or anything else. Any combination of the three is possible. E.g., a time series would be abstract and temporal data. In total we have 7 combinations of the 3 characteristics, signified by the hexagon glyphs. Let's go through some useful models to motivate why it is necessary to succeed at the aforementioned parameter space analysis tasks. Image segmentation is used, for instance, in medicine to separate healthy and unhealthy tissue. The input data is an image, not changed during analysis. The segmentation algorithm takes some additional parameters, and the output is a segmented image. Flooding simulations let us plan safety measures ahead of time. Parameters are barriers to be placed somewhere. Input data is the surrounding environment, output is the water volume over time. The last example is a physics model that outputs whether or not the volume is balanced, which allows to 3D print cool figurines. Thus, our research question was, how do proposed visual parameter space exploration approaches for spatial or temporal data work in terms of interactions and visualizations? In other words, how do they show inputs, parameters and outputs to support parameter space tasks, and what are common possible interactions with the system, like what can analysts do and how do they do it? Regarding related work there is of course the survey and conceptual framework by Silvia et al. From 2014. Also surveys in ensemble visualization touch upon parameter space exploration. In contrast to these surveys, our survey accounts for a broad selection of models and focuses on the user interface. To answer our research question we conducted a systematic literature review. The most important inclusion criteria were that the paper had to present interactive visualizations supporting at least one parameter space analysis task. It had to be peer-reviewed and published in 2010 or later. We excluded papers that described models where input and output were abstract data and papers considering hyperparameters for machine learning models. Here are a few graphs about our process. On left is a flow graph of the pipeline. You see that from 3 seed papers we found 526 papers through forward and backward, citing and cited by search, from which after screening and assessment remained 101 papers. On the right you see the paper count per year and paper count per outlet. The most common outlet was TVCG and we cover the extended visualization community. We selected 57 papers randomly for thematic analysis, following the method by Braun and Clark. This process has 4 stages. First you generate initial codes, from which you develop themes. Then the themes are reviewed and properly defined and named. The first author conducted the first 2 stages while all authors contributed in the latter stages. In the QR code you will find a link to the service installation presenting all 101 papers with their themes. All 526 papers are listed in the supplemental material, as is a table with reasons why each of the 101 papers received a given theme. Let's dive into the themes we identified, though I will skip over some subcategories to leave space for discussion and open challenges at the end. The themes can be seen as steps in a generic parameter space analysis workflow. First of all, we need to come up with parameter settings to investigate. These approaches are covered in the Finding Parameter Settings theme. Then we compute the corresponding outputs and visualize their relationship. We identified 9 visualization idioms in the input-output visualization theme. After that, the analyst has some hypothesis in mind and interacts with the system in a way that reduces the amount of data to reason about. These strategies are mostly data transformations, covered in the data case organization theme. Some models can be changed at runtime, which is the model tuning theme. Finally, we keep track of parameter settings with analytic provenance. In the finding parameter settings theme, we further distinguish between who the main actor is, human or computer, manual versus automated, and how much freedom the actor has, leading to the 4 strategies on the slide. They are illustrated by a polygon standing in for a spatial parameter. In the manual unconstrained case, the human can position any vertex anywhere, while in the constrained version vertices may only be placed within the rings, a parameter subspace. Automated approaches sample the parameter space and consider output quality or not. In the manual unconstrained case, we can further distinguish between direct and indirect manipulation interactions. The former was more common with spatial parameters, presumably because it's easy to find intuitive visualizations and interactions. Conversely, indirect manipulation was more common with abstract parameter spaces. A good example for direct manipulation is by Coffey et al., where the parameter is a biopsy device, which is configured by drag and drop on its components. Moving on the manual constrained theme, we find, for instance, pick from suggestions, approaches. Here the available parameter space is reduced to a few fully configured points. In the example shown by Umatani et al., it was used to suggest fixes for a broken shelf design. We also found steer by rating approaches, where the parameter space is iteratively shrinked until it is the desired point. Important here is that in each iteration we consider a subspace, like the 2D plane in the example by Koyama et al., in the image processing domain. The idea is that after pointing to the preferred solution on sufficiently many rotated planes, we can find the boundary of the desired parameter space. Finally, there's automatically adapt partial solution, in which, as the name suggests, the user provides a partial parameter configuration and the system fills in the rest. The rest can be less important design parameters or just stuff that is really tedious to do manually. The example shows the 3D figurines by Prevost et al., where the user provides the hull and the computer calculates the necessary distribution of negative space to balance the shape. When we consider the computer as the main actor, we find approaches for random sampling. These are mostly approaches for abstract parameters, so the question is what to do with spatial or temporal parameters. We found 2 possible solutions. Either describe the spatial or temporal parameter with abstract data, e.g., a rotated box would be a 4D parameter space for a volume, or sample from a shape grammar, which is a set of construction rules. Looking at supervised approaches that incorporate some objective of the output, we find as the most simple approach unsupervised sampling and post-processing to prune 2 similar or bad parameter settings. In addition, a wide range of optimization strategies was employed. Maybe most interesting are custom methods, which were most common with spatial parameters. In the example by Kanev et al., in the context of flood simulations, the system tries to find a barrier configuration that protects important buildings. It does so by applying domain-specific rules during the simulation. For example, if water crosses the perimeter, the system spawns an alternate universe in which there's a barrier there and checks if that is sufficient for protection. Moving on to input-output visualizations. We identified 9 idioms that can be distinguished by the relation of their coordinate systems. Here are some examples. The most common idiom was juxtaposition, in which we have 2 separate coordinate systems that are not connected by marks and their relative position is irrelevant. In the example by Orban et al., they deal with a 5-dimensional abstract parameter and the output is a time series. Parameter settings and outputs are shown in separate views, which are multi-dimensional projections to 2D. Associated parameter settings and outputs are linked by color. The idea is that one can do sensitivity analysis by selecting a parameter subspace in the left view and check how far spread out the associated outputs are in the right view. Then we saw embedding a lot, in the sense of making an integral part of something. We have only one visualization, therefore one coordinate system, and parameter settings and outputs are visual variables. The example is by Mateoiko et al., who consider a generative model for monitor stands. The scatterplot has a derived number from the output on the x-axis and parameters on the y-axis and in the color. As a scatterplot shows correlations, one can directly see that monitor stands get heavier the more load they must support. Superposition was also often used. Here we have two coordinate systems that are overlaid and actually the same, because lengths and sizes directly translate between the two. This of course only works with parameters and outputs on the same domain, but then allows exact comparisons. The example shown is by Liu et al. In the context of prostate cancer treatment. The parameter is pictured in the bottom left. You have this grid in which you put needles containing radioactive seeds. The goal is to target the tumor with the radio. Finally, I want to talk about alignment, which is when there are separate coordinate systems but their relative position is informative. Examples would be small multiples of outputs arranged in the order of an input parameter. Or tabular visualizations like the one in Eichner et al. For time series segmentations. Each row contains data of one segmentation algorithm execution. The parameter setting is encoded on the left in grayscale, the segmented output in color on the right. The idea is that when the table rows are arranged in a useful order, dependencies between parameter settings and outputs become visible. E.g., you see that the big wide red segment coincides with the second parameter being at the black setting. Next up we talk about the data case organization theme, in which the goal is to somehow reduce the amount of data the analyst has to consider and reason about. We identified 5 sub-themes that help achieve that. These are mostly data transformations when you consider the Infovis pipeline by Card et al. The themes are, as all others, not mutually exclusive and may actually be combined to compute complex information. If you want, you can also think about them as blocks in a SQL select statement. The first theme is focusing, which is concerned with reducing the number of elements or their spatial, temporal extent. Then we have derivation, in which we compute some simpler data from a complex object. Aggregation answers questions about a population, i.e., we are interested in central elements or outliers. Sorting and grouping are self-explanatory, I think. So one thing that may be interesting is how to filter temporal and spatial data by these characteristics. The example is from Matteo et al. And the monitor stands. The idea is to superimpose all of them, then cast rays through the scene and remove or keep monitor stands that the ray intersects. So in the top row we filter for monitor stands that have a hole somewhere. Derivation was a popular strategy to convert temporal or spatial data to abstract data, which can then be nicely presented in standard information visualizations. We found that derived data either detects desired features in the output, such as ridges in a vector field or the length of a segment with a given label, or it measures the output quality. The latter can be achieved either by data type intrinsic quality measures, such as the amount of intersecting triangles in a mesh, or by comparison to a reference, which may be obtained from domain experts or even legal codes. With aggregation, on the other hand, we seek answers about a population of complex elements, and thus the data characteristics have to be retained. E.g., we could be interested in an average time series. Summary statistics tend to be sufficient for abstract data, while for time and space more sophisticated approaches are required. The example shown is by Rojo et al. And simulated particle trajectories. In the visualization are 2 particle sizes, indicated by color. In this spacetime density plot, the differing trajectories are clearly visible. Let's briefly discuss the last 2 themes before we move on to open challenges. Some models can be changed at runtime, which is captured in the model tuning theme. This is especially common for pipelines, which are common in time series or image processing. If you consider the whole pipeline the model, each change to a pipeline step modifies the overall model behavior. It may also be the case that the surrogate model is cheap to produce, e.g., when it is a linear regression. Then it can be updated during the VA session and trained on different data subsets. Some models also contain information that may be useful to extract and show to the analyst. E.g., regression coefficients were used to quantify parameter sensitivity. Weight matrices of a neural network were inspected to confirm whether the neural network learned domain-aligned heuristics and dependencies. Finally, there is provenance, which was practically always analytic provenance to keep track of desired parameter settings and outputs. Bookmarking as in selecting desired elements which then show up in a separate list was the most common way to solve this issue. So to quickly recap, our research question was how proposed visual parameter space exploration approaches for spatial and temporal data work in terms of interactions and visualizations. We analyzed papers obtained with a systematic literature review and found common visualization idioms, such as juxtaposition, embedding or alignment, data transformations, such as derivation, aggregation or grouping, and interactions to obtain new parameter settings. We will provide some outlook for the future. To do so, we will first have to revisit some of the challenges mentioned earlier in the literature and relate our findings to those. Sedemere et al. Mentioned the data acquisition gap, which had to do with the fact that models are often computationally expensive and it's thus infeasible to sample parameter settings within the system. From the numbers on the slide, the gap does not seem to be a big issue in our survey. But we do see another kind of acquisition gap. Automated sampling approaches get more difficult the more trade-offs there are to consider, or the more constraints exist on feasible solutions. Consider, e.g., lighting design. All the light sources, their attributes and position, are the parameters to light a space. The designer has to consider client wishes, budget, legal requirements and aesthetics. Unless the sampling also considers many of these things, it will not be useful. Additionally, papers in our survey suggest that designers want to quickly iterate on solution candidates. But we didn't see any proposal as to how such local variations can be intuitively produced. Sedemere et al. Also mentioned the cognition gap, which had to do with understanding high-dimensional spaces. Specifically, they mentioned the problem of visualizing Pareto fronts for more than 2 metrics. A solution that may scale to, let's suppose, a dozen metrics could be the one proposed by Schultz et al., who use barocentric coordinates on geometries with as many vertices as there are metrics. So for a 2-dimensional front we have a line. Colored regions on the geometry denote solutions leading to a certain kind of trade-off, favoring a metric more the closer to the corresponding vertex it is. In the ship example, we minimize drag and maximize mass, so the ship on the left has least drag and mass, while on the right we have most mass and drag, with some compromise in the middle. More broadly addressing the cognition gap, I want to show how it can be tackled using manual constrained interaction, more specifically, using inverse design as coined by Coffey et al. In 2013, and a suitable surrogate model. The example is from Hazarika et al., who consider a yeast cell protein simulation with 35 parameters. The main workflow is that analysts specify a region on the cell where they wish to see, e.g., maximum polarization. The surrogate model predicts the necessary parameter settings and also quantifies each parameter's influence on that output. Continuing to guidance, we found all guidance degrees as specified by Senida et al., and provide examples for optimization tasks. There was orienting guidance, visual cues, after automated sampling and output quality derivation in the work by Amirkanov et al. Directing guidance in the form of suggestions we showed earlier already in the shelf building example by Umatani et al. And prescribing guidance can be found in the 3D figurines by Prevost et al., where the system dictates the distribution of negative space inside. More challenges mentioned in the survey by Sedemere et al. Collaboration. We also found no papers that tackle a collaborative parameter space analysis process. The closest we got was a paper by Kanev et al. That considered that the choice of flood protection plans had to be explained to other stakeholders, e.g., the public. Provenance. As mentioned earlier, provenance mostly concerned keeping track of a couple of parameter settings. As such, the future work of tracking which parts of the parameter space have been explored or not can be considered partially solved. How good parameter settings can be transferred between datasets is a less explored provenance-related question. Scalability. Besides excessive derivation, we found few suggestions how to deal with large amounts of data. Evaluation. We found they were often conducted without human participants, but of course due to our broad selection of outlets the interactive visualizations were not always the main contribution. Now to challenges from our survey that are not also in the other survey. For one, we found that the time, space characteristics are unevenly covered in the literature. On the right you see a contingency table of parameter characteristics and analysis tasks. For cells highlighted in red we didn't find any papers and only a few for cells highlighted in orange. Generally it seems that parameters that are not just spatial or abstract are under-researched. Then we noticed a lack of data variety. Most papers consider one parameter, often abstract, and one output, often spatial, temporal. We don't know yet how to deal with multiple, possibly heterogeneous, outputs or additional structures like sets, graphs or hierarchies in the context of parameter space exploration. In addition, papers reliably account for uncertainty in prediction tasks, i.e., how far off is the model output from some reference. But the input data might as well be uncertain, e.g., when we consider imprecise real-world measurements or estimated parameters of populations in census data. Such cases are less explored. And with this I close the presentation. Thanks for watching.